Today's episode is about the crash of Flight 401, the rescue effort, the investigation, and the spooky ghost stories some claim haunted Eastern airline flights after this crash. Our story began on December 29, 1972, when Robert Marcus and Rayburn Dickinson, they were in the middle of the Everglades, which is a swampy grassland in Florida, and they were trying to catch bullfrogs. It was a completely moonless, dark night, and all they can see at the distance was the city. Robert had a headlamp that he used to kind of see the reflection of the eyes of the frogs so he could catch them. Now suddenly he saw at the distance the lights of a big jet kind of flying over the Everglades. But this wasn't kind of unusual since Miami International Airport was like right there. What was unusual, however, is suddenly he saw a big orange ball of flames as big as 3 football fields that lasted less than 10 seconds. And then he knew the airplane had crashed. Immediately they jumped into the airboat and started to drive toward the direction where the light had come from. But they couldn't see anything. It was dark. I mean, the flames of the explosion just lasted a few seconds. So sometimes they will turn the motor off to try to hear, and then they will hear people screaming and they will go towards the direction of the sound until they finally reach the crash site. He could see like bodies laying everywhere. Some were upside down. He could hear people screaming and people completely naked. And then suddenly he heard somebody asking for help that was relatively close to where he was. So he looked around and he finally saw a man who was still buckled up in his airplane seat. And he was trying to keep his head above the water, but he could see that the head would go under the water and then back. And when the person finally saw Robert, he begged for help. He said, "Please help me, I cannot do this very longer." So Robert, he jumped into action. He pulled the person upright, away from the water so he wouldn't drown. And he made it his mission to save as many people from drowning as he could that night. Many minutes passed and they could hear a helicopter flying above them, but the helicopter was having a hard time finding the crash site because it was dark. And the aircraft didn't have any flashlights because they were mandatory at that time, so there was not like a flashlight that they can use to kind of let people know where they were. And 2, after the crash, one of the flight attendants had instructed everybody not to light any kind of light, like a match or anything, because they were basically covered in plain fuel. Robert, however, had his headlamp and he started to sign the helicopter of their location, and thanks to him, they were able to find the crash site relatively quickly. The scene was overwhelming. They couldn't believe that there were any survivors. The aircraft was just little pieces everywhere. But they found a group of survivors all together and they were completely bloody, dirty, soaked in the fuel from the aircraft and mud from the Everglades, and some were naked. Their clothes were shredded or completely removed by the force of the wind blast and the brief fire. But there were some people that were singing Christmas carols to keep from dying. You see, after the plane crash, which was very unexpected, there was no sign that they were about to crash. In fact, some of the survivors said that when the plane first touched the ground, they thought they were landing, and then the plane shook forcefully and broke into pieces. One of the flight attendants, her name was Beverly Raposa, she freed herself and she realized they have crashed. And she tried to move in the swamps, but it was very muddy and very hard. It will take a lot of effort, and every time she moved around, there will be a piece of a charred metal, and she cut herself a couple of times. But she wanted to help people because she could hear all the passengers screaming for help. So she started screaming herself and say, "Hey, I'm one of the flight attendants. If you hear my voice, try to come toward where I am." And she did, and some of the passengers came to where she was, yet there were other people who couldn't move. And the only thing that she thought that could help prevent people from panicking or going into total emotional distress was to sing Christmas carols. And she started singing and people sang along. And this kept people calm, but also helped the search team to find their location. As the search team were looking around, they found a lot of people who had died, but they also find survivors, like Ronald Infantino, who was in the flight with his wife of only 20 days, and her name was Lily, and they were on the route to Miami to go celebrate the holidays with her family. During the flight, at one point, she went to the restroom, and when she came back, they switched seats. And when the plane crashed, and he woke up, he was very injured and barely above the water. His leg was completely messed up, his arm was almost completely off, but all he could do was screaming for his wife. Eventually, he was rescued and taken to the hospital, and he learned later on that his wife didn't make it. There was also an 11-month-old Miguel Junco who survived the flight, but both of his parents, Miguel and Alina Junco, did not. Then we have the story of Mr. and Mrs. Casado, who were sitting next to each other, and they had the 2-month-old baby in the mom's lap. Upon impact, the baby was just thrown off her mother's arm. So as soon as they were able to unbuckle themselves, they started looking everywhere. It took them, I think, more than 20 minutes, and finally they found the baby all around, like, the wreckage, but she was alive and she was fine, and in fact she was the youngest person to survive the crash. But there are also the stories of people who didn't make it or who died on impact, like Evelyn de Salazar, who always traveled with her companion poodle, and she was basically thrown from her seat when the plane crashed, and the little poodle survived. Others, like Captain Love, actually survived the crash but died shortly after, before they were even rescued. Many believe the reason people survived the crash was because the soft floor from the swamps kind of cushioned the crash of the airplane, and also because the mud kind of helped cover the wounds of many survivors and prevent them from bleeding out. However, there was a lot of bacteria in the water of the swamp, and this later on caused people to have an infection known as gas gangrene, where they can either lose a body part or even die. The rescue efforts continued until the early hours of December 30th, and then it was the task of recovering the bodies of the deceased. So what happened that day? You see, Flight 401 was scheduled to departure from JFK Airport in New York at 9:20 p.m. on December 29, 1972. And they were going to go to Miami International Airport. There were 163 passengers and 30 crew members. This airplane was massive. It was one of the new jets from Lockheed, the L-1011 TriStar. And this was the time where the airlines really care about your comfort. It could hold up to 256 passengers. It had 7 bathrooms, and it had a lower gallery for the flight attendants to prep the meals or warm up the meals and bring them back to any passengers, because they used to feed you back then. Anyhow, it was one of the most intelligent airplanes of its times, with an autopilot feature that would fly the plane, but also it could land the plane on its own. The captain of the plane was Robert Love, who was 55 years old. The first officer was Albert Stockstill, who was 39 years old, and the flight engineer was Donald Ripper, who was 51 years old. Altogether, they have over 50,000 flight hours practice, and of those 50,000 hours, 639 were specifically from the L-1011, because this was a very new airplane. There was a 4th person inside the cabin, and he was a technical officer named Angelino Donadeo, and he was traveling back home after an assignment, but officially he was off duty. The flight itself was completely uneventful. Once they reached Miami International Airport, they were getting ready to land. However, when they lowered the landing gear, which there were 3 of them, 1 in each side of the wing and 1 in the nose of the plane, the light indicator showed that everything was working fine, for the nose landing gear didn't turn on. So they didn't know if there was a problem with the gear itself or if there was a problem with the light indicator bulb. Captain Love contacted the air control and he went, "Hey tower, this is Easter 41. It looks like we are going to circle. We don't have the light on our nose gear yet." The tower told them to climb straight ahead to 2,000 feet and circle over the Everglades. Once they reached the desired altitude, they put the autopilot to hold at 2,000 feet and try to resolve the problem with the landing gear. So at the beginning, they were like, okay, let's try to take the little ball out and see if it's fine. And they were having a very hard time. One, Captain Love couldn't really reach, and then the co-pilot and the engineer, all 3 of them were trying to figure out what was happening. At one time, they were able to take the light out, but when they put it back in, they did it wrong and it got jammed. And they were like very frustrated because it's been almost 10 minutes trying to solve this little problem. So Captain Love just turned around and say to the first engineer, Repo, just go down there to the electrical bay, which is known as the hell hole, which is right underneath them. So he had to open a hatch on the floor and go down and kind of squeeze. And in there's like a little small telescope kind of hole, so he can actually see if the landing gear was down. So he went down, but no soon after, he just popped his head from the hatch door and he said, "Hi, I cannot see anything at all. It's the wheel lights on." So they check and turned the lights on, and then he went back down to check again. At that point, Angelo Donadeo, who was the technical officer, went down with him to kind of check and see if he could assist in any way he could. At that moment, the control tower noticed that the altitude of the plane was showing 900 feet. However, sometimes the radar will give a false reading, so they will wait for the radar to go a second time to confirm if that's true or not. But he decided to contact 401 anyway, and he was just like asking, "Hey, how are things doing over there?" Captain Love was, "Oh, we just want to turn around and come back in." And since there were no signs of any distress or problem, they were given the instructions to return. No longer after that communication, Flight 401 completely disappeared from the radar, followed by other airplanes calling and letting them know that they have seen a huge explosion over the Everglades. Emergency servers were sent to the crash site, and in total there were 75 people who survived the crash. 99 died on the crash site, and 2 died later at the hospital. Of course, an investigation was started, and they discovered that when the Flight 401 was turn around to the airport, the first officer Stockstill noticed for the first time that there was something wrong with the altitude. You can even hear him ask in the voice recorder, "Did we do something to the altitude? We're still at 2,000, right?" Then you hear Captain Love ask, "What is happening?" And boom, they crashed at exactly 11:42 p.m. The first thing that touched the ground was the left wing because they were slightly turning to go back to the airport. Then there was a fireball that rushed all through the cabin, followed by a blast of cold air like a tornado as the plane just basically completely disintegrated. The wreckage of the plane was scattered everywhere. I mean, there was a couple of huge pieces, but almost everything completely disintegrated, and it covered an area of approximately 1,600 feet long by 300 feet wide across the Everglades. As they studied the voice recorder, they heard a warning sign that lasted like half a second. It was a C-chord sound that came from the engineer's workstation, but he was down at the hell hole at the time it happened, and neither the captain or the co-pilot have shown any sign that they heard the sound, and therefore there were no corrective actions taken. The question is, why did the autopilot stop maintaining the 2,000 feet altitude? It is believed that at one point Captain Love turned around to talk to Engineer Repo, and he nudged his control wheel ever so slightly, but with enough force to disengage the autopilot's altitude hold without realizing it. And the descent was so gradual that they didn't notice it. The National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the cause of the accident was the failure of the flight crew to monitor the flight's instrument during the last 4 minutes of the flight. They believed that the pilots were so distracted with the malfunction of the nose landing gear indicator that they failed to notice that the plane was descending. Now, as a result of the accident, a new training program called Crew Resource Management was created to ensure clear communication between crew members and to make problem solving more efficient. For example, instead of all of them focusing on the problem, one should have been flying the plane while the other tried to solve the problem. And here's where the spooky begins. Even before the crash, 2 weeks early to be exact, Doris Elliott, which is a flight attendant for Eastern Airlines, she was working when she had this weird vision. She saw an L-1011 flying over the Everglades towards the Miami airport. And it was very dark at night, and in her vision she saw as the left wing kind of touched the ground and crumbled into little pieces. As you can imagine, she was very shaken by what she saw, and another flight attendant asked her what was wrong, and she explained what she had seen, and she was very worried because she had had other premonitions in the past that became reality. She even knew that this was going to happen near the New Year's. Just after the crash, Sandy Messina, the wife of Rosario, who was at the flight, was waiting for him at the gate with her 2 sons. And she just had this bad feeling that something was wrong. There was something wrong. Then she heard the very familiar whistle, the one that her husband makes every time he gets home. Then she turned around and there was no one there. And she knew at that moment that her husband was dead, even though nobody had told her that the plane had crashed. Now, time passed and strange things started to happen in other planes from the Eastern Airline, specifically the other L-1011 TriStar airplanes. One day, one of the flight attendants was down at the lower gallery getting the meals ready when she saw the face of a man in the reflection of one of the glass ovens. And she kind of freaked out. So she went upstairs and got another flight attendant, and they both went downstairs, and she too could see the man. So they went and got the flight engineer, and he could see the man too. And he recognized him as Don Ripple. And the man in the reflection said, "Watch out for the fire on the airplane." Now they were able to land without any problems or any fire. But not longer after, the same airplane was flying out of Mexico City when one of the engines got on fire, and fortunately the pilot was able to land without any problems. So one day, there was a flight attendant that we're gonna call Mary, and she was at the lower gallery preparing the meals for the passengers. But she suddenly felt cold and clammy and very uneasy, so she kind of got spooked and decided to go upstairs. As she was going upstairs, another flight attendant that we're gonna call Katie, she was going downstairs, so they basically miss each other. So when Katie got downstairs, she couldn't see anyone, but she started to prep the meals, but she had the feeling that somebody was looking over her shoulder, so she kind of kept looking back to see if there was anybody there. And she had this feeling that there was someone in there. So eventually she kind of looked around to see if maybe Mary was hiding somewhere to scare her, but there was no one there. So she went back upstairs and she looked horrible. I mean, she looked pale, and another flight attendant said, what is wrong with you? And she was like, nothing. I mean, she didn't want to sound crazy. And in fact, they knew that anybody who reported any abnormal things were being sent to the psychiatrist. So she was like, nothing. And she was like, no, come over here. Let's go to talk to Mary. So when they shared the stories, they realized they kind of were experiencing the same thing. But they didn't want to report anything because anybody that reported anything to the airline, they were either losing their jobs or sent to the psychiatry. On another day, another flight attendant was at the lower gallery, and at this time she was ready to go back upstairs. So she pushed the elevator button, and as she waited for the elevator, she see this mist. And at the beginning she kind of worried because she thought maybe there's something wrong with the plane. Should I call the flight engineer? But the more she looked at the mist, the more this mist kind of transformed and became more solid and solid. And she started to freak out, so she's like pushing the button of the elevator to hurry up, and eventually this mist transformed to a full human head with glasses and all, and then the elevator door just opened and she just like freaked out and left. And then there's the story of the extra passenger. As one of the flight attendants was making head counts to make sure that the manifest matched with the amount of passengers, she realized there was an extra person, and she counted the heads again and said, there's an extra person here. Then she saw a man in a pilot uniform and realized, oh, that must be the extra person, because sometimes pilots or flight attendants or crew members that needed to go to a different location for either an assignment or just to go back home will ride in the plane. And back then, pilots or the crew members will just find an empty seat and just board, and then they will get the information. So she goes to where this man in pilot uniform is and asks, oh, hello, can you please give me your name so I can add you to the manifest? And he acted like she wasn't there, and she was like, excuse me, can you please give me your name? And it was like she was completely invisible. Then there was another flight attendant that saw what was happening, and she also got to the pilot and start asking questions. I mean, to this point, more passengers around were like kind of paying attention to what was happening, but the man will not say absolutely anything. So they decided to go get the pilot to come and talk to this pilot because they needed the information. As the pilot came to the area, he kind of lowered his head to the same level of the pilot that was sitting to see who he was. And when he saw his face, he kind of froze and kind of jumped back, and he said, it's Bob Love, meaning Robert Love, the captain of Flight 401 who died on the crash accident. And then he disappeared, and everybody freaked out, even the passengers that were around. And the pilot was like, search the whole plane, but there was no one in there. Another spooky story was about a second officer who kept hearing the noise of knocking right at the hellhole, which is that place under the pilot's cabin. And he decided to open the door and check to see what was happening, and he saw the face of Don Ripple. And apparently Don Ripple has been seen in many other places, like the engineer workstation or conducting a pre-flight check. He has been seen like fixing ovens, and some even claim that he said there will never be another crash on an L-1011 because we won't let it happen. Ghost stories continue to circulate from both passengers and crew members who claim they have seen people disappear or something unusual. And it doesn't help that the airline allegedly tried to keep the ghost stories hush-hush by removing any records of such encounters from the logbooks where the crew members will log anything unusual that happened during the flight. There's a theory though. When the investigation of the crash of Flight 401 finished, they had several parts of the plane that were completely fine, so they were returned to the Eastern Airline, and people say that these pieces, like the oven or the elevator, were put in other flights with the model of the L-1011. And the ghost apparitions only happened where these pieces were. Eventually, people claim that Eastern Airline removed those pieces, and then the ghost stories stopped. What do you guys think? Do you think that Ripple and Robert Love were really hunting those airplanes? And were any of you in any of these flights? It will be interesting to know a first-hand experience. And what do you think about this horrible tragic accident where 101 people die? I mean, that was so sad, and especially because it seems like nobody knew they were about to crash until it just happened. So what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. Anyhow, on December 29, 2022, on the 50th anniversary of the crash, a memorial for the Easter Airline Flight 401 was placed on Curtis Parkway in Miami Springs, Florida, to honor the 101 people who died that day.